Okay. Hi, I'm Kelly. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a PhD student in English at Boston College. And this is my presentation, The Octopus and the Other, Capitalocene Contradictions in the Symbolic Order. So within The Octopus, the first book of Frank Norris's uncompleted Epic of the Wheat trilogy, the sprawling Pacific and Southwestern Railroad monopoly operates throughout the San Joaquin Valley with tentacles of steel clutching into the soil as the soulless force, the colossal, the octopus. As a story of California, the novel functions similarly, with storylines unfurling as curious tentacles themselves, each grasping for meaning under the soulless force of the market economy. These plots abound through the market, with many fighting for a sense of self against the railroad company. Perhaps the most unique struggle, however, is in Vanamy's search for meaning. Whereas the others all indirectly raise questions of accountability and their plights, none come near Vanamy's direct quest to discover the other. So, as Presley recalls early on in the first chapter of Vanamy, a terrible drama had uprooted his soul. He here refers to the violent death of Vanamy's past lover, Angela, who was sexually assaulted by an unknown figure and who subsequently passed away during childbirth. Since then, Vanamy has remained fixated on the one question: who was the other? Even more, the answer to this question would constitute the answer, for which he prayed with words he could not say, for what he did not understand. As Philip R. Polifron argues in his essay, The Stock Ticker in the Garden, Frank Norris, American Literary Naturalism and the Capitalocene Aesthetics, the same chapter surrounding Vanamy's search for an answer to understand this trauma equally raises the question of, quote, the industrial rape of the natural and the contradictions birthed by the Capitalocene. So, to build upon the Marxist foundations of the Capitalocene's politics, a Marxist-psychoanalytic approach here further enables the reading of these shared struggles together to understand the others, respectively the unknown other to Vanamy and the Lacanian notion of the big other to the capitalist symbolic order in relation to each other. So, read together in this way, the assaults in the novel illuminate how the search for the other effectively obscures the psychoanalytic understanding that there is no big other, or the understanding that the symbolic order is already inherently contradictory. So, as Polifron argues, the assault of the land under the Capitalocene raises questions of accountability. However, through the parallel assault of Angela, the octopus also importantly raises the relevance of psychoanalysis to eco-criticism, whereas contemporary new materialist thought often reflects an attempt at rejecting anthropocentrism. This paper will instead argue that the push away from philosophies of subjectivity instead forestalls our ability to reckon with the libidinal economy's centrality to issues of ecology today. Or, in short, eco-criticism must confront the problem of the subject in order to decenter it from the Anthropocene. So, to begin where the novel does, the capitalist marketplace serves as the big other, as the symbolic order of the text through which all understandings are mediated. So, as Presley bikes through the barren and dusty landscape where there had not been much crop to haul that year due to overcultivation of the monoculture, he is confronted with this organizing presence. On an all but finished sign he passes by, an advertisement reads out, S. Berman has something to say to you. Berman's advertisement introducing him as the predominant capitalist figure in the text stands in here for the capitalist marketplace's big other. And as a contradictory framework, its representation need not be finished because it can never be complete. Instead, the contradictions within the capitalist symbolic order are elided by money as a master signifier. So within the process of signification, a master signifier refers tautologically inwards toward itself, rather than pointing outwards toward other signifiers, and it thereby stitches up the holes or lack within the big other. That is to say, the master signifier serves as the quilting point that thereby stabilizes meaning around it through preventing against the slippage of signification. For Marxist psychoanalysis like Slavoj Žižek, this impression of wholeness constitutes ideology, or a theory of non-contradiction. At the level of meaning, however, this capitalist symbolic order is already inherently contradictory. As Adam Kotsko articulates in Žižek and Theology, money as a commodity becomes self-referential. Money is worth or signifies money, instead of being worth X number of commodities, and all other commodities are worth or signify money. As the advertisement also suggests in its direct address to the you reading it, this contradictory symbolic order nevertheless mediates subjectivity. For the ranchers, this ideological force is most apparent in discussion of the wheat industry and the relationship as subjects constituted by it. As Polifron explains, this force of the wheat comes to contain the entire systems of relations that produce it, and is best symbolized through the stock ticker on the Los Muertos ranch. During a flurry in Chicago wheat pits in the August of that year, Heron and Magnus had set up nearly half of one night, watching the strip of white tape jerking unsteadily from the reel. At such moments, they no longer felt their individuality. The ranch became merely the part of an enormous whole, a unit in the vast agglomeration of wheatland the whole world round, feeling the effects of causes thousands of miles distant. So when no longer feeling their individuality, the ranchers here experienced something like Freud's notion of oceanic feeling, or a feeling of wholeness with the world. However, for Freud, this feeling, if it exists at all, exists only in the primitive ego feeling of infancy. That is to say, the oceanic feeling of wholeness does not exist for subjects in the same way that a symbolic order of wholeness beyond contradiction does not exist. Despite this, the novel's exposition here betrays the ranger's ideological investment in the capitalist marketplace. So as the plot against the railroad company progresses, this question of contradiction in the capitalist symbolic order is first raised within the text through the question of accountability. As Daniel J. Mrozowski argues in How to Kill a Corporation, Frank Norris is the octopus and the embodiment of American business. This question of embodied accountability was central also to real ranchers at the end of the 19th century. Though Norris drew inspiration primarily from the historic Muscle Slough tragedy of 1880, Mrozowski contextualizes the novel further within corporate history. Though no one individual decision or jurist can be said to have authored the personhood of the corporation, the 1886 case of the Santa Clara County versus the Southern Pacific Railroad has traditionally been cited as the turning point in the conception of the corporation. In its ruling, the railroad corporation effectively became an economic being independent from its individual members. This paradoxical nature of corporate personhood constitutes the symbolic order of the text. As a banker, real estate agent, and political boss, Berman also works for the railroads and therefore comes closest to embodying the cruelty of the PNSW Corporation to the ranchers in the novel. However, when the ranchers do attempt to hold Berman accountable for the corporation's cruelty, the novel veers its closest toward satire. Most dramatically, near the novel's close, Presley even throws a bomb into Berman's home that miraculously leaves Berman unharmed. The octopus here all but laughs at the rancher's struggle for accountability from the slippery paradox of unembodied corporate personhood. Rather than through Dyke or Presley's violent actions, it is instead the weed itself that eventually defeats Berman through suffocating him. However, even without him, the force of wheat continues on. For this reason, the raised question of accountability remains looming throughout the length of the novel, thereby revealing its understanding of contradiction. So as Polifron argues in his essay, these central contradictions are what constitute the text as Capitalocene literature. In Capitalism and the Web of Life, Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital, Jason Moore begins to articulate this framework for addressing contradiction as an attempt at overcoming Cartesian dualism within the Anthropocene. For Moore, this move beyond the object is beyond the environment as object necessitates a new ecocritical methodology that shifts analysis from the additive arithmetic of green thought in the interaction of independent units, nature and society, to the dialectics of humans in the web of life. In his later work, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Moore argues further for conceptualizing a world ecology, joining power, nature, and accumulation in a dialectical and unstable unity. Capitalism is here conceived not just as an economic system of accumulation, but instead also as a way of organizing nature, as a multi-species situated capitalist world ecology. Within this dialectical framework, capitalism itself then becomes paradoxically naturalized, as is evidenced throughout the octopus's depiction of industry. This is immediately apparent for the wheat industry as a non-native industrial monoculture. Subtler, however, is the ideological naturalization of the railroad as a corporate monopoly, despite defying the natural market laws of supply and demand. So regarding this, Walter Ben Michaels argues in The Gold Standard and Logic of Naturalism that the law of supply and demand is the law that sets rates in a free market, but the railroad as a monopoly doesn't operate in a free market. The whole point of monopolies, like the railroad, is that they transcend the mechanical laws of the market. James Dorson clarifies further that this is the market paradox involved in the theory of natural monopoly. So emerging naturally through competition in the marketplace, monopolies subsequently eradicate market competition and thereby result in market failure. So regarding this failure, the marketplace must then paradoxically regulate competition to safeguard the regulatory function of competition. So whereas Dorton ultimately regards this as the novel's embrace of contradiction as regulatory fiction committed to saving capitalism from itself, Holofernes instead argues that this is how the text successfully anticipates the Capitalocene. So articulating Capitalocene aesthetics further as one of contradiction in individual and collective agency, Holofernes locates this tension in the Octopus, as well as in American literary naturalism more broadly, through the depiction of humanized nature. Arguing against reductive readings of the genre's environmental determinism, Holofernes highlights the countercurrent in the period's environmental thinking, in which humanity's planetary agency was beginning to be recognized. For Holofernes, this latent understanding of Capitalocene contradictions manifests within the novel in the strange sublime of individual laborers engaging with the natural Californian landscapes ravaged by the wheat industry they labor within, as with Presley looking out over the valley. From this perspective, Presley experiences the strange sublime, quote, as the imagination itself expanded under the stimulus of that measureless range of vision, even those great ranges resolve themselves into mere foreground, mere accessories, irrelevant details. This reveals another of the Capitalocene's paradoxes. Individuals are insignificant in the fate of this collective force, and yet, through it, experience a seemingly limitless extension of agency over the natural world, an extension that arises and becomes sensible in Norris's hands through the structures of capitalism. This revelation, however, occurs here only on the larger level of the novel for readers. Presley has yet to confront the contradictions of the marketplace as a symbolic order precisely because he has yet to experience his own insignificance relative to the railroad industry. Instead, as the subjectivity is here constituted by the capitalist symbolic order, this experience reaffirms his own ideological investment in the wheat industry as the nourisher of nations, the feeder of an entire world. Identifying with the big other, Presley experiences, quote, a sudden uplift, a sense of exhilaration, of physical exaltation, as he seemed to dominate a universe, a whole order of things. But the novel characterizes him here as drunk with the intoxication of mere immensity. A more apt description might be that Presley is here experiencing the illusory wholeness of capitalist ideology. So, moreover, the wheat industry is here importantly naturalized through the metaphor of sexual assault. Holofernes draws our attention to this metaphor in his reading of Capitalocene aesthetics through Norris's naturalism and its depiction of capitalism and nature in ways that show their increasing inseparability and the birth of a planetary force defined by their combination. So following Norris' framework, the Capitalocene here highlights the dialectical relationship of humanity and nature and humanity. Even more, Holofernes argues, this is where the industrial rape of the natural produces an assemblage of the human and the natural in the novel that is at once of the earth and a threat to it. That is to say, within the contradictory framework of the Capitalocene, industrial capitalism is here refigured as natural. The narrative of this assault is as follows, quote, it was the long stroking caress, vigorous, male, powerful, for which the earth seemed panting, the heroic embrace of a multitude of iron hands, gripping deep into the brown, warm flesh of the land, that quivered responsive and passionate under this rude advance, so robust as to be almost an assault, so violent as to be veritably brutal. There, under the sun and under the speckled sheen of the sky, the wooing of the Titan began, the vast primal passion, the two world forces, the elemental male and female, locked in a colossal embrace, at grapples in the throes of an infinite desire, at once terrible and divine, knowing no law, untamed, savage, natural, sublime. In emphasizing the two world forces of industry and nature, gendered here respectively as the elemental male and female, the sexual assault progresses in its logic from the additive green arithmetic of Cartesian dualism to the dangerously dialectical sublime, terrible and divine of capitalist world ecology and its infinite desire. Directly following this, the narrative then pivots toward Vanamy's own suspended state of infinite desire, following Angela's sexual assault and subsequent death. And providing these parallel assaults within the same chapter, the Octopus suggests a paralleled meaning, as well as it raises a series of questions. How do we read Angela's assault alongside the industrial assault of the land? What is the relationship between the unknown other and the big other of the capitalist symbolic order? And how does this pairing engage with the novel's larger question of accountability? To the first of these questions, many scholars have taken up Angela's assault as a mystery to be solved. Beginning in The Rapist and Frank Norris's The Octopus, Stuart L. Burns argues that Frank Soria must be the unknown other through equating context with circumstantial evidence, as Father Soria frequented the bench where the two lovers met. Even more, after the assault, the other had withdrawn into an impenetrable mystery. For Burns, this continued mystery supports the contention that the rapist escaped detection in the same way that Poe's Minister D hid the purloined letter, merely by continuing in a role so conspicuous as to be above suspicion. In his essay, The Genesis of the Rapist and the Octopus, John Jolly pushes this logic even further by countering, quote, "What role could be more conspicuous, yet less subject to suspicion, than that of the lover prostrated by grief?" Vanamy's later supernatural experiences can then be understood as his attempts at reliving that night in an attempt to rectify it. Lastly, in Sympathy's sliding scale, individuals and large forces in Frank Norris's The Octopus, Ashley Ganji argues that the novel's shifting spatial and narrative scales serves as the overarching moral principle, reconciling the inconsistencies of the ending by suggesting that moral truth is a question of perspective. For Ganji, Vanamy is only able to understand this larger perspective about the cyclical pattern of growth and decay associated with the seasonal rhythm of crops once Angela is restored to him through the figure of his daughter. Furthermore, inconsistencies within the text can then be understood as descriptions of the balancing act individuals attempt to strike between their narrow perspectives and a larger understanding. To this, a Marxist-psychoanalytic reading would instead counter that the novel's inconsistencies instead reveal inconsistencies within the symbolic order itself. As subjectivity is mediated by the symbolic order, the subject internalizes this dynamic as if it were an individual struggle. Even more, beyond the individual constitutively lacking subject, all other subjects are equally lacking as well, and no perspectival shift could overcome the existing gaps within the symbolic order or within subjectivity itself. For this reason, the question surrounding the other has never been a puzzle for scholars to solve. Instead, this unknowability suffices as its own answer within a Marxist psychoanalytic framework. So to return now to Vanamy's suspended state of desire following the sexual assault of the land, we are confronted with the deadlock of it. After his work is done for the day, Vanamy ruminates upon his lost love. The mingling of their lives was to be a perfect life, the intended ordained union of the soul of man with the soul of woman, harmonious as music, a foretaste of heaven. In this vision of his life with Angela, Vanamy imagines a union of wholeness through a love transcending lack. In this way, Vanamy positions his lost love as the objet petit a, or the object cause of his desire. Within psychoanalysis, this paradoxical object emerges in being lost as a positive negativity, thereby embodying lack. As an impossible object, it thereby stands in for an ontological completeness the constitutively lacking subject can never obtain, and its emergence thereby occurs only through the retroactive production of the illusion of former wholeness, as in the vision of ontological completeness figured by the infant with the maternal body. So while visiting the mission garden where he and Angela met, Vanamy's love emerges as its being lost as a lived recollection. Quote, "His love for Angela rose again in his heart. It seemed to him never so deep, so tender, so infinitely strong." This objet petit a of his lost love then informs his object of desire in discovering the identity of the unknown other who sexually assaulted her. After being away for years, this desire drives him to seek out Father Suri at the mission. Immediately, Vanamy asks him, has any discovery been made, any suspicion developed as to the other? And he responds, no, is a mystery, it always will be. Despite this, it is still the search for meaning that drives Vanamy forward. For Vanamy, however, actually obtaining the object of desire and learning the identity of the other would do little to comfort him. Instead, Vanamy would be confronted with the reality of his desire's basis in lack. That is to say, actually obtaining the object of his desire would mean risking awareness of the object cause of his desire as a central void. In How the Octopus pairs the two assaults of the earth and of Angela in Vanamy's chapter, a similar pairing might also then be found here in Vanamy's search for the other and the novel's cast of characters' search for meaning, as well as accountability with and within the capitalist marketplace as the big other. Just as the question of the other remains unresolved within the novel, the problem of contradiction within the symbolic order remains unresolvable. And ultimately, it is a search for the other for the purpose of embodied accountability that perfectly obscures a psychoanalytic understanding that there is no big other to hold accountable. Um, excuse me. Betraying an understanding of how money stabilizes meaning within the symbolic order through meaning money as the master signifier, the continued search for meaning in the novel for an embodied other of corporate personhood to hold accountable for the contradictory cruelty of the capitalist marketplace's big other is then also a search for stability. More specifically, Vanamy's search for the unknown other within the novel later informs Presley's search for the big other in his confrontation with Shelgrim, the president of the railroad company. Through a Marxist psychoanalytic reading of the Capitalocene, Presley's attempt at stabilizing meaning here then can be understood as an attempt at locating a quilting point within the capitalist system's implication of all those involved within it. That is to say, Presley searches for an embodied other within the unembodied big other to halt the slippage of implication within the Capitalocene and to provide a final answer to the novel's enduring question of accountability. These contradictions of the Capitalocene, however, cannot be elided through locating a master signifier in a single figure of blame. To Presley's accusations, Shelgrim pushes back, "You're dealing with forces, young man, when you speak of wheat and the railroads, not with men. The wheat force is one, the railroad another, and the law that governs them, supply and demand. Men have only little to do with the whole business." In this way, Shelgrim as the master relative to the railroad rejects Presley's attempt at identifying him as the master signifier to quote the question of accountability. As Mrzowski insightfully concludes, this confrontation in the corporate headquarters is staged not for the answers it might provide, but rather for the symbolic revelation of the profound vacancies Norris suggests are at the center of the corporate form. Presley, in response, falters as Shelgrim insists that he cannot control it. It is a force born of certain conditions, and no man, can stop or control it. And this way, Shelgrim betrays an understanding of the contradictions of agency within the Capitalocene. So rather than embracing these contradictions, as the Marxist psychoanalytic position would demand, Shelgrim instead defers to his ideological vision of wholeness through the force of the marketplace. Being confronted with these two paths forward, embracing contradiction or returning to the ideological illusion of non-contradiction, Presley also recedes, reflecting forces, conditions, laws of supply and demand. Were these then the enemies after all? Not enemies. There was no malevolence in nature. Nature was then a gigantic engine, of vast power, huge, a leviathan with a heart of steel. In this way, the Capitalocene naturalizes itself as well as it forestalls any reckoning with its central contradictions. The final lines of the novel endorsing a larger view are then endorsements of capitalist ideology. The larger view, always and through all shams, all wickedness, discovers the truth that, in the end, prevails, and all things surely inevitably resist as they work together for good. The octopus, in its final embrace of the wheat that remain, exceeds itself as an ideological project through drawing attention towards its central lack. Even more, the novel thereby also endorses a Marxist psychoanalytic approach toward understanding the excessive lack that remains within the capitalist symbolic order. In this way, Marxist psychoanalysis bridges dialectical materialism and new materialism and embracing the contradictions of the Capitalocene's world ecology. Thank you.